Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us on the InScope podcast. My name is John Scott. I'm the CEO of ScopeStack, and I'm really excited to have back on our podcast Skip Tappen. So Skip used to be the CEO of NWN. He's been in the IT services industry for quite some time now, and I'm just really happy to have him joining us on the podcast, providing a ton of his experience. Skip, thank you for joining us.
What did you say before? 80 plus years? Is that what you were telling me, John?
Yeah, I think 80 plus years is what I saw on your LinkedIn, how much experience you've had. So I do really appreciate you joining us. And the topic I want to get your
back.
Yeah. And the topic I want to get your input on today is profitability, but specifically, how does pre-sales affect the profitability of deals, the business, and really just how does that all layer into what is a very important metric to an IT services business, which is profitability, right? So,
sure.
So I think just to start, right, I think would be helpful is a little bit of the foundational elements of IT services and like revenue, cost, profitability, and like kind of what all goes into that. So, could you?
So maybe a place to start is actually defining profitability, if you will.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And I think, when you think about defining, as you said, really profitability in its simplest form is revenue minus costs, right, equals your profit. And at least my experience with service organization, what you're really talking about is gross profit at this point, right? And gross profit really is first defining what costs you want to incorporate into your service organization, and that's decisions to be made there, right? And then the revenue sits on top. So from a cost standpoint, the question is, all right, what cost do we want to actually have in our COGS, or cost of goods sold, or in this case, cost of services sold? And the starting point for that obviously is the engineers. And so, when you think about engineering costs, what you're really trying to do is come up with a standard cost element. And standard cost for engineering starts with how much you're paying your engineers, number one. Right. Number two is how many billable hours do you expect them to have? Usually do it on an annualized basis. So you got their salary or their total compensation package for the year, their total billable hours for the year, right? And you divide one by the other, right? It's going to provide you with, therefore, what your cost per hour is for your billable hours.
Right. And those are the costs that you're going to use to price out engagements, right? So price out solutions to be delivered to the client. Right.
Sure. Right. And you can then get as sophisticated as you want kind of within there. So for example, right, do you just have an overall engineering pool where you just have an engineering standard cost for the entire team? Or do you then instead have a standard cost for project managers versus technicians versus, we used to call them consultants versus, right, senior engineers? So there's potentially different segments. You may want to segment your delivery team, because then you can get more granular with your costs. As I said, the other part is, okay, how many billable hours do you expect an engineer, right? In total, if you think about it, right, total possible billable hours, right, in a year is 2080. In other words, 2,080 hours, and that's a result of 40 hours times 52 weeks. Nothing.
Yeah, it's an important number to know. Honestly, I mean, I think you talk about it like it's just you've talked about it so much, you just know it, right? But that is. You need to know that. I mean, that's a critical element, right, of pricing this out. So that's a good call.
Absolutely, right, for common standard cost. So and then you say, well, at a minimum, even the most diligent engineer, you got to figure you're going to give a little vacation. So
just a little bit.
Just a little bit, right? So the question then is, how many of those 2,080 hours do you expect them to be billable? Because those are really the only hours for which you're actually going to gain revenue. So those are the hours under which you actually have to spread out your costs. So if they're only going to work half the time on billable work, then really in that simple math, I would say they only have 1,040 hours to actually recover all of their cost. That's the way to think about it.
Is there a number that you would have used? Like, is there a number that you either target or that you use for all these assumptions that you're
so then it kind of varies about the kind of services you're delivering, right? My personal experience is if you're doing a series of short projects, your chargeable targets are lower because it's really difficult because you have 2 hours down here, you got travel time there, depending on whether you charge for that or not, right? And so you have these short segment projects. So there, in that case, if you can get, again, my personal opinion, 60, 70% chargeable. So 60% of the time they're actually billable. That's actually, I think, a pretty good number. But if you can get longer projects where they're lasting a month, 2 months, if that's the kind of services you as a business are delivering, right, then your billable hours you expect to go up. And the broadest example, right, is if you move all the way to staff aug, which is a type of IT service, right? Staff aug, the expectation is they're practically billable the entire time. So then your chargeability or billable target goes up significantly into the 90s.
Yeah.
But that's some food for thought there.
Yeah. So, all right. So to kind of back up, so you're starting with, and let's talk about just one resource rate right now. So let's talk about an engineer, just as a general term. So salary, let's say they're $100,000 a year, and then you're going to take 2,080 hours, and you're multiply that times whatever billable percentage you're going to just target. You're going to assume.
Exactly. So let's say for the moment it's 70.
Sure. You can do that math, right? I picked 60, but but again, so do you know 70% off the top of your head? I'm sure you could figure that out here in a minute. But
70% at 2,000, right, would be 1,400. So it's a little more than 1,400 hours.
All right. So let's say that. So then you're going to divide $100,000, or sorry, I did the denominator wrong. You're going to divide one by the other, right, to get to your hourly rate, essentially.
Exactly. Hourly cost.
And so whatever that number is. And
just to back up 1 second, so we're keeping it simple here again, but at that point you said $100,000. So other things you have to decide whether you actually want to incorporate it into your cost or not is, do you include their benefits?
Right.
Do you include any other expenses they may have? Do you include any overhead for sales managers? Some people put those into the services cost. Some people actually put those in G&A, right? And I think one of the reasons why I potentially put a lot of those below the line, if you will, is because people like to drive to a higher services margin percent.
Right. Is there a best practice in our industry that you've seen, or is it really just preference and again based on?
I don't know if I refer to it as best practice, but I would say a common practice in my mind is put most of those costs actually in G&A and not up in cost of services.
Got it. Okay, so it's not the fully burdened rate of that resource.
Exactly. They kind of minimize that and really try to keep the cost component down. Yep. Because what they're really trying to drive to is, and we've talked about this before, when people are trying to value businesses, people expect a certain services margin, and by putting those costs below the line, in my terminology, right, that makes it look like your services margins are higher.
Right. Yeah. No, it makes sense. And again, there's a balance, right, between, okay, so we're getting to that hourly cost, which is going to then convert into our hourly bill rate that we're going to use to price out engagements potentially, right? Sure. So then you have to decide, okay, well, if my hourly cost is, let's just say $100 an hour, and I'm going to mark that up, say, I don't know, 30 something percent. Let's say I want to get to $150 an hour. Is that competitive where I'm selling services, right? So you're always having to balance.
Exactly.
Right, across that.
Exactly. At the end of the day, typically the rate, right, you don't get to pick the rate. Right, the rate is actually dictated by the market, right? All you can do is manage your cost, right, relative to the rate. I mean, you can say, I'd love to get this rate, but not necessarily the case. And that's one of the reasons why I think sometimes people go to more granular models, because then if you have just a general, right, cost for all your engineers, and you picked $100, I would suggest it's probably more than that.
Oh yeah.
Then if you price all engagements out with that higher rate, then all your projects, you're going to be coming in really high. By contrast, if a lot of the work could be done by a technician, and you could get a technician that's a $90 rate, then your overall cost of your project would be reduced. So it's that balance between complexity of your cost model with being competitive and winning the business.
Yeah, and choosing the right resource to do the work, right? And that all leads to the competitive nature of it. And so
Yeah.
And so really that lands on, which billable rate to use, how they're pricing the project. That really lands on, again, with the assumption that the pre-sales team is responsible for scoping out projects. That really lands on that team to price these engagements out, use the right resources, and get to a selling price, right, for a service, for a solution that they're delivering to the client. And so,
yeah,
I guess, and really what I want to talk, like, how does the role of pre-sales affect profitability in an organization? Like, how can they have an impact on these pieces that have already been defined, right? They've been defined by the business. Like, how do they play a role in that? Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things there. First and foremost, that they now got your standard costs, where the pre-sales engineer is going to go through and configure, right, what services need to be done to meet the customer's requirements. So they're going to come up with a list of services that are required, right? And based on that, they're going to drive to a particular price for the project. So at its fundamental level, you'd say, well, okay, they don't really have an impact because it's just going to be rate times time, and here's your price customer.
Right.
Where in my opinion, they have a huge impact is in a couple of ways, right? If you get the right pre-sales engineers, right, solution architects, I would argue, right, they could sell a premium. So some organizations are very successful in winning, and not because they had the lowest price. So a lot of customers, I think, are willing to pay more, maybe not the top price, but certainly not necessarily go to the bottom price if they have more confidence in the organization that's going to be delivering it. And I think the solution architect is a key component of instilling that confidence, such that they'll be willing to pay more. So number one is how they can play a role is by instilling confidence, which potentially means the customer's willing to pay a premium for your organization.
Right. And what is that, in your opinion, like, what is that? Sorry, you're going to mention another one there.
No, go ahead. Well, we can go on.
I was going to say, so instilling confidence, like, is it technical aptitude? Is it clarity around the problems that the client has and how they're going to solve them? Like, what have you seen be like? So you've seen a lot of successful pre-sales engineers out there, like,
yes, right. And put yourself in a customer situation. What do you want to hear? I would say the first thing you want to hear is that they understand my problem.
Yep.
So there's nothing more frustrating as a customer than either you keep getting the same question asked over and over again, or, right, the solution that's presented misses the mark relative to the problem I presented. So number one is really understanding the customer's requirements. And it's not just technical requirements, they're timing requirements, their budget requirements, right? It's the whole enchilada.
Right.
Number two is then the technical aptitude, because at the end of the day, we used to do a lot of customer surveys. And the way the customer would describe it is, if I'm the CIO of the organization, I'm looking, my boss is looking to me to get this project done in a certain way.
Right.
I'm asking you to get it done on my behalf. So who am I going to pick? Right. After it comes after price, I'm going to pick the one that's got the best chance of success.
Sure.
Right. And I think success is one of the key elements of success is defined or based on the feeling that these guys have the technical aptitude to get the job done.
Yeah.
So I think the solution architect is the key one that's instilling that, I would say, in the customer, at least initially.
Yeah, 100%. And I would say, and I've said this before, but like, pretend like you've been there before. Pretend like you've done it. Like, I hate the idea of coming in to a meeting, right, and like we're having to reinvent the wheel every single time, like that kind of concept. Like it seems like we've never really perfected doing XYZ service. And me as a solution architect, like, it's hard for me to instill confidence if I don't have confidence in what we're doing, right? And so, like,
I think that's fair.
I think there's an element of like having the internal enablement. You mentioned sales enablement on a previous podcast, but internal enablement that equips me as a solution architect, a sales leader, an engineer, whatever role, to then go to our clients and say, I feel very confident that we can do these things. right? And so I think there's a whole mix there, right? But
there is, right. If you're sitting, if again, put yourself in the seat of the customer, and the solution architect says, the last 5 times we did this, we did this, 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 and this, right? As a customer,
it's huge.
Versus, the solution architect is saying,
right.
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, you just taught me something. Right? But being able to say, like, sitting in that meeting and someone asks a question, says, "Hey, can we do X, Y, and Z?" Well, no, because we tried X before, and these are the fallbacks there. We tried Y, that was successful, so maybe, right? And so, like, you've been there, you've done that. And granted,
and think about it, right? So if you're again a CIO or you're a technical leader inside of an organization, why are you hiring an outside service organization?
For the experience.
Right? So typically for the experience. I mean, that's one of the key things that you're hoping that your team probably could get it done, but they've potentially never seen it before. There's going to be bumps in the road and the like. So one of the primary reasons typically service organizations are hired is for the experience. So as going back to the original question on profitability, potentially getting a premium, right? The idea about instilling that confidence through your personal knowledge as well as experience of the company you're selling for, right? I think is a key element which can drive to profitability.
Sure.
I think the second one, right, from a profitability standpoint, then goes to clearly defining the scope. I'd say one of the biggest impacts on profitability is scope creep. And I would say scope creep comes in 2 forms, and both, I think, are a result of a poorly written statement of work. The first form is the customer, who, if it's vague or not defined in a particular area, the customer either implicitly or explicitly, right, taking advantage, right, of the vagueness.
Yeah.
Right? Either, well, when I talked, I'm now a delivery engineer. When I talked to the sales and the solution architect, they said this.
Right.
Well, there's nothing in the document that helps clarify it one way or the other, so now you're right in a bind.
Sure.
I think the other kind of scope creep occurs by the Good Samaritan engineer, which I would say most delivery engineers are Good Samaritans, and they just want to solve the customer's problem.
Yeah.
So if it's not clearly defined in there, and the customer says, "Hey, can you do this also?" Usually, my experience is sure, right? But they also typically, right, delivery engineers are focused on trying to do. They like it black and white, right? They're engineers, right? They like things clearly defined. And so if it clearly says they shouldn't be doing that in the scope of work, I think they have no problems, therefore, saying no. But when it's vague or incomplete in that area, they're going to default towards, right, making the customer happy, which is their job. So I think both of those have a huge impact on profitability.
Yeah, and so that scope, right? So pre-sales engineer, I'm scoping an engagement. I'm going to get to a price, so $50,000 and 50 hours, whatever, right? As an example. But that is, and so in that model, we have targeted profitability or expected profitability that we want to achieve as an outcome of this project. However, more times than not, that's not always spot on, right? So the actual profitability on a project is all driven by actual hours, not estimate of hours, right? And so what's been your experience in the delta between those two things, so the difference between those two things, and how do you track and normalize that? Like, you've seen a lot of that, I'm sure, right? Like,
So I think we the terminology I use is a plan margin versus actual margin.
Right.
So for us, it's a key metric, right? Because every statement of work, right, that you give to a customer has a plan margin in it should have a plan margin in it by definition.
Sure.
Because if you have standard costs, then you know what your cost should be or expected to be, and then if you have a price, the profits the difference between those two, which can define your margin. So that's a planned margin, right? To your point, then actual margin is we now actually delivered the project, and through the delivery of the project, we actually have certain people that applied their time to it, which then caused the actual cost, right? The actual margin. So why can they be different? as you imagine, a whole variety of reasons. But some of the key ones that experienced is, number one, going back to scope creep. So overall, we had estimated it was going to be 200 hours, and it ended up being 300 hours. So, and you go, well, why was it 300 hours? And I'd say, again, fundamentally, the reason it was 300 hours is it was either missed something in the scope,
Yeah.
and or what I call a poorly written scope, which for me means it's vague, right? There's things that just weren't clearly defined. So it's either we've missed something, unfortunately, which is part of the key piece of the pre-sales process, and or we just didn't clearly document what we had assumed, and therefore the engineers did more, the customer asked for more than we had originally assumed in our 200-hour budget.
Right.
So that's kind of one whole side to the reason why you can get a gap between the planned margin and the actual margin.
And so as a best practice, would you always recommend people review planned margin and actual margin as a post-mortem or post-project analysis? Is it only projects that vary?
I totally, because there's other reasons then as well. So when you do post-mortems, right, another classic one of why the margin's different on the actual project is, okay, when I scoped this thing, I said a technician, right, should be able to rack and stack. I said the technician should be able to hang all the APs. I said the technician, right, should be able to do some of the basic fundamentals. We gave a lot of hours for it, but it was a low-level resource. Well, we went to actually staff the project. Guess what? There weren't any technicians available. They weren't around, right? So instead, it was the consultant or the senior engineer, right, who ended up doing a lot of that busy work because they were the only one available. So now I got a senior engineer hitting the project where I'd expected, the standard cost of a technician. So, that's part of, the things to do. That necessarily see in the postmortems. But yeah, I think what's challenging with the postmortem approach is, if there's a way to actually do it such it can be relatively automated,
right?
It's awesome. My experience, it's very time consuming, right?
Yep.
And again, in general, try not to do plugs for ScopeStack and where things are going, right, with ScopeStack. But as you and I have talked about ScopeStack, the ultimate goal is such that you can actually have the PSA tool circle back and give you that feedback directly in the ScopeStack. So within a click of a couple of buttons, you can actually get that comparison and continuously improve, right, your pre-sales process.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I've never seen anything out there, right, that can go from pre-sales to post-sales, pulling actuals back and comparing that to my standard rates, my standard level of effort, right?
Yeah,
that's...
Yeah, we used to have project managers do it, right? And it's just a time-consuming process if you really want to do it in any level of detail. So I think, my opinion, the utopia of that is how do you get it back to the pre-sales team very efficiently such that, they have that closed loop so they can then update, right, their pre-sales, right, how they configure the next one of those projects to make sure, I should have gotten that in there.
Right.
Or I should make this assumption, relative to something the customer needs to provide, which we didn't think about, right? So you get that closed loop, so continuously improving on your SOWs.
Yeah, because again, it could be that could impact in a couple of different ways, right? It could be, hey, we keep scoping this for 10 hours, but we can deliver it in 4. So vice versa, I may not be competitive if I keep using the same recommended level of effort in 10 hours. Yeah. So I need to know where are we off, where are we over scoping, and on the same side, where are we under scoping? So we keep saying it's going to take 10 hours, but it actually takes us 20 instead. We need to make sure that we include that on the front end when we scope our next engagements to be 20 hours. Because again, this all comes back to that planned margin versus actual margin, right? Because that's what we're all judged on, right? Is how much money we're making on each of these engagements. And then that's, essentially the kind of cornerstone of the business is making money.
And I think one of the things you said is really critical to the whole thing, right? It's all theoretical if you don't sell anything.
Sure.
Right. So at the end of the day, it all works great in Excel, right?
Yeah.
But where it all starts is if you're not competitive with your services business, then you don't have any revenue to deal with in the first place.
Right.
So all of these things have to work in concert so that you can also be competitive in the marketplace.
Yeah. I mean, you can't talk about you can't talk about profitability without revenue, right? And so
you can't talk, exactly right.
It's a critical component.
It's kind of critical component, and it goes all the way back. We talked about chargeability a minute, or billable time a minute ago. Well, if you don't have enough revenue to keep those engineers busy, ideally you want them to be busy 70% of the time. But if they're only busy, if you don't have enough business to keep them busy 70% of the time, then your standard costs are also out of whack.
Yeah.
So it's a perpetual machine which constantly needs to be. We used to call it feeding the beast.
Feeding the beast.
You got to keep feeding the beast, right? One of the key things is how do you make sure you have enough backlog of services to keep everyone busy. Yeah. And that's another challenge with service is just tricky, right? So another challenge with it is the fact that if you have too much backlog, it's great for keeping everybody busy, but then you have a bunch of upset customers because they don't want to say, the salesperson doesn't want to go, well, we could get to you in 6 months. Right. That's another way that they'll pivot to the next company.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great point, right? Like, as you and I were kind of talking about this earlier, it was two critical metrics for a services business. Profitability is one of them, but that customer sat piece is another really big one, because if they're not happy the first time, they're not going to come back the second time, right? And it's just not good practice. And so, there's this balance. And now I definitely want to call this podcast "Feed the Beast" is definitely what I want to call it now.
Circling all the way back to where the conversation started is, and so the critical role that the pre-sales team plays in all of that is, if you think about culling, we talk about the profitability, but in order to be profitable, you differentiate yourself, be competitive, turn things around in a timely fashion, and all those things. Right? So another way that pre-sales team's critical in profitability is you got to be able to flip statements of work quickly, right? Because otherwise you're therefore not competitive. You're not going to get the business, and if you don't get the business, you don't get the revenue, and therefore you don't get the profit.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw a stat that was like it takes something like 18 business days on average for most services organizations to get a statement of work back to a client, right? And I guarantee that if you continue doing that, someone will figure out a way to deliver to the client in 10 days, or like most of our ScopeStack customers, delivering it in the same day that they're having the meeting, right? So like to your point, like you've got to drive that speed, that turnover, but it has to be accurate and consistent. And so there are all these balancing pieces of it, right? And so the idea of removing as much manual effort as possible, because there are a lot of data points constantly evolving, then the better.
It is, right? And how do you make it as repeatable as possible? Right, is the other one we always talk about, right? And going all the way to the idea about the closed back loop, right? You want to make it as repeatable as possible. You want to keep improving on it, right? Because you can't stand still, because someone else will figure out a better way to do it.
Yeah.
Awesome. It always keeps it interesting.
Yes. All right. So in that vein, we always like to offer up some sort of practical advice that someone can use today, tomorrow, in the future to improve their business, their services business. Based on this topic, and you've provided us a lot of advice in the past, but based on this topic, what are some things that VARs, MSPs can do? Not even maybe one thing, two things, however many things.
In this we talked before, and I said it was difficult to boil it down to one. This one, to me, it's the fundamentals, it's the basics. So it seems pretty rudimentary, I think, but sometimes that's the place to focus, is writing a really good statement of work that incorporates as much as possible, right? It also says what you're not going to do and is articulate as possible. I think it relates to that. That's probably one of the most fundamentals that can actually have the biggest impact, right? On that the pre-sales team, right, can do. There's certainly things as an organization, other things, but specifically the pre-sales team, the better the scope of work, I'd say, the better for everybody, and especially as it relates to profitability.
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely some tweetable quotes in there. The better the statement of work, the better for everybody. But again, Skip, thank you again just for joining us on the podcast. You've been there, you've done a lot of this, and you just have a wealth of knowledge to provide. So, always appreciative of you hopping on the podcast.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, again, thanks again, and hopefully we'll talk soon. For those of you interested in more about InScope, you can subscribe to the podcast at scopestack.io/podcast. Again, thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon.